Chapter 281, Mammon 5. The Promised Land was not far away, so the Skull Unit and the Black Orc Squadron descended from Tiamat, the giant red dragon, and moved, together with the southern forces. With Skull on his back, Bucephalus raised his head and looked at the sky. Salami, who was his everlasting opponent and bad friend, was not in the sky. Actually, Salami was on standby inside Tiamat to help Yong-ho out during the most crucial moment of the battle. Bucephalus did not know the outline of the operation of the upcoming battle properly. His dear boss Skull explained something to him, saying, Skull, as always, but Bucephalus couldn't understand it at all. But he didn't care because his duty was always the same. He was supposed to carry his boss on his back and run around the battlefield with vehemence. Bucephalus made a loud noise to express greetings to Salami. Of course, he didn't get any reply from Salami, but he didn't care. He was convinced that his message was clearly conveyed to his boss, Salami. Salami moved his crouched body slightly, making a little groaning. He could not be seen from inside the hangar of the giant red dragon Tiamat, but he knew from his experience that Tiamat was now heading for the battlefield. The start of the real fighting was imminent. Salami curled up a little more. He saved his stamina, thinking of Bucephalus, who must be marching on the ground. He couldn't show his shabby status at the moment to Bucephalus. You will arrive at the first gathering place in 30 minutes. The northern forces are gathering. It looks like both the northern and southern forces are entering the Promised Land at about the same time. The southern forces were the enemy of the northern forces, but strangely enough, they never communicated with each other about when and where they would fight, but they were drawn to each other. Adjusting the speed of their movement, they marched to the Promised Land. The northern troops at the first gathering place were close to 200, which was almost twice the total of the southern forces. There were 3 reasons why the southern forces responded to their northern counterparts' demands for fighting. First, they would ravage the territory of the Queen of Fury if they were not stopped. Second, the southern forces could not afford to drag their feet long because of the celestial world. Third, the southern forces believed they could beat their northern counterparts this time. You are lying if you can say you are not scared about this fighting. Right, Lucia said to Yong-ho's subordinate spirits gathered at the bridge. Not either. Of course, not, Kaiwan and Eligos shouted in the negative respectively. Scathatch and Ophelia smiled gently at the same time. With Gusion making a hearty laugh, Catalina, who was looking around nervously, tapped her chest after erecting her ears and tail. Not scared at all either. While everyone laughed and showed confidence, Yong-ho, who was sitting in the captain's seat, turned his gaze slightly to the side. He naturally made eye contact with Citri. Instead of saying something, Citri simply smiled with her eyes, then put a hand on Yong-ho's shoulder. It was her small move, but he felt heightened a lot. They were nearing the Promised Land now. It was time for the real fighting. The Queen of Fury once again held the horn in her hand. Unlike the other subordinate spirits, she stayed on the ground, not joining Yong-ho's expedition army. Since she was the head of the 8 clans, despite Yong-ho's subordinate spirit, she thought of standing at the forefront of her forces, as always. But this time, she couldn't just take the lead to fight. In this battle, she had to carry out a mission that only she could do in her capacity as the head of the 8 clans. The tribesmen of the 8 clans stopped marching and lined up. It was the first time that the Queen of Fury saw so many of her 8 clans gathered in one place. Everyone looked at the Queen. Over 70,000 eyes of the tribesmen in the sky and on the ground were fixed on her. The Queen took a deep breath. She was thrilled with lots of mixed feelings. When they looked at her, their eyes were full of mixed feelings of fear, courage, respect, and affection. The southern army was silent. With their mouths shut, they just waited for the Queen to give an order. In no time, they were letting in and out a breath like one. It was the breathing of a huge army as one. Kutimuka squared her shoulders and raised the flag in her arm. Gardimundi also raised a royal banner next to it, symbolizing the Queen of Fury. Finally, the Queen opened her lips. She shouted in a thunderous voice, which nobody imagined could come from her small and slender figure with everybody tight-lipped. Fighters of the 8 clans, warriors in arms. Feeling thrilled at her thunderous shouting, they strongly responded to her by raising their weapons simultaneously. The Queen kept shouting, "Descendants of the Dragon Lord, all demon warriors in the south. The Dragon Legion watched the Queen of Fury. The spirits belonging to the Mammon family and the dungeon market shone their eyes. When her large army cheered and shouted with joy, the queen didn't agonize to impress her soldiers with eloquent speech. As always, she just spoke her mind honestly. The enemy is over there. Let's defeat them all together to save the demon world. Let's save our lives. Her goal was to defeat the Northern Army and close the Celestial Door. In other words, she wanted to save everyone who lived in the demon world. There was a thunderous applause from the Southern forces again. The Queen of Fury turned, then stared at the Northern Army located in a place that was not far away. She had a horn in her mouth and blew out loud without hesitation. Everyone heard the sound of her blowing the horn. Now, the battle began finally between the Southern and Northern forces. The arrows shot from both sides filled the sky. Magic bullets fired from the wild monsters burned the sky in a beautiful curve. With all of that attack going on, the Southern Army rushed to their Northern counterparts. The Northern forces also charged at them. Biryu Bakcha, the head of the Garura clan, saw tens of thousands of monsters rushing toward them. Dragon Lord Ankablosa ordered the Dragon Legion to just wait, even though the monsters were rushing toward them. The distance between the Southern and Northern forces gradually narrowed. In a few seconds they were going to collide, and at that moment hundreds of them would be killed. Bucephalus also rushed. Skull, which was on Bucephalus' back, lifted Baphomet's sickle. At that moment, Citri, standing on the deck of the giant red dragon Tiamat and looking down at the battlefield, began to move. She lifted the wand that she had made on the same day when the dungeon market was born in the demon world. It was Citri that made the dungeon market, but she could not dominate it alone. The demon world was too vast for her to manage alone, and she needed time to heal the poison of the celestial world. While she had been asleep for dozens of years or several hundred years, she needed somebody who had to run the dungeon market on her behalf. So, Citri set up the system of 5 directors. In return for downgrading her status as one of them, Citri could maintain the welfare policies that Mammon had introduced. Over time, her status became gradually equal to that of the other 4 directors of the dungeon market. Because of this, Citri had prepared one secret weapon from the time she created the dungeon market. Although she became complacent over the course of 1,000 years, she had been thoroughly betrayed by the other directors 1,000 years ago. Her secret weapon was the master key of the dungeon market. She had kept it from the other directors until now and put it in total secrecy. Citri injected mana into the cane. As the owner of the dungeon market, she ordered all those who had gone through the dungeon market until now, stop. Her short order soon became a reality. The mana unleashed from the master key filled the entire battlefield. The various subordinate spirits that Abrasax took out of the warehouse in the north obeyed her order. Even though the southern forces were nearing them, they just would not move. They literally stopped on the spot. About half of the beasts flying in the sky stopped flapping their wings. They also stopped using their superpower that helped maintain their existence in the sky. Left to gravity naturally, they just crashed to the ground. The subordinate spirits of the King of Pride, the King of Envy, the King of Lust, and the King of Gluttony also faithfully obeyed Citri's order. Most of them experienced going through the dungeon market before the crest of the dungeon market, still remaining under the crests of the 4 kings, blocked their movement. Citri knew that the moment she used the master key of the dungeon market, the whole demon world would know it, so she could not use it twice. It was a massive power that she could never use twice once she activated it. The entire northern army got frozen on the spot. There were still some of them moving, but they had no choice but to stop, because the rest of them didn't move. But the southern army did not stop marching. They stared into the eyes of those northern forces who could not move properly but who were conscious. Those at the forefront of the northern army were terrified. The reality that they could not move even their fingers when their enemies were right in front of them created a tremendous fear. They could not even think of their death because they were totally overwhelmed by fear. Standing at the forefront of the southern army, Skull swung Baphomet's sickle violently. Rikum and the Black Orc squadron struck the helpless northern army with their own weapons. The vanguard unit of the southern forces struck the northern army right in front of them. Without slowing down their vehement strike, The southern forces destroyed, trampled upon, and smashed the northern army. The bodies of those at the forefront of the northern forces were shattered to pieces and scattered in all directions. Nonetheless, the northern forces could not move. The increasing bodies of their fellow soldiers drove their tense hearts to extremes. The blood and flesh of their dead fellow soldiers covered their faces, followed by the southern forces' relentless attack with spears and swords. Chapter 2A2. Mammon 6 Bifrons, who was in charge of the entire northern army, instinctively realized what happened. That was why he clenched his teeth. He knew why his enemy didn't use this power in the last battle. At the same time, his old friend whispered into Bifron's ear, the northern forces were being killed at a terrifying rate. If the current massacre were not stopped, the entire northern forces could be annihilated in a matter of time. Bifrons clenched his teeth. It was only then that he realized who he had betrayed. Citri. Before she was the Queen of Sloth, she was one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market. She was the very woman who created the dungeon market in the demon world. Abrasax shouted in anger. He desperately struggled to get out of the current impasse, but the northern forces who got frozen on the spot would not move. Even if there was someone who flew over their heads, none of them signaled danger or tried to attack. Even if Citri had not activated the master key, the northern forces would not have captured her. It was none other than Samael, the fastest wing of the dungeon market, who crossed the space. She flew at a speed that was even difficult for one's eyes to catch, and rushed to Abrasax. With the master key, Citri naturally found out the exact location of Abrasax, who wielded the power of the dungeon market. Abrasax also saw Samael. Erecting 7 horns on his head, he unleashed the strongest mana of the dungeon market. But Samael was not scared. She brought out the power of her master, Yong-ho, as well as the power of greed, gluttony, and fury through Brigada. She destroyed Abrasax's mana by wielding much stronger power than she had as a director of the dungeon market. Right at this moment, she wanted to take revenge on him on behalf of his subordinate spirits, including Carrot Bifrons, laughed bitterly. Yong-ho's 12 subordinate spirits appeared before him. The 2 red demons, who had been fired like bullets from the giant red dragon Tiamat, rushed to Bifrons like a beast as soon as they landed on the ground. They were Eligos and Ophelia, the 2 beasts under the command of the King of Greed. Moreover, Tigrius stood behind them. Faced with the 3 subordinate spirits with 6 horns, Bifrons raised his cane instead of giving up. Since he knew instinctively his final moment was imminent, he enjoyed this moment. He unleashed mana violently. Sometimes, people felt the passage of time differently depending on their feelings. Only a few seconds in the eyes of others seemed like such a long time to Citri. Citri's master key was by no means an absolute power. There were only 20 seconds left for Citri to halt the entire northern army. The highly advanced, the subordinate spirits, and the strongly they were under the influence of the King of Pride or the King of Lust, the faster they would be freed. From the influence of the master key, it was impossible to annihilate over 200 northern troops within 20 seconds. Because of that, Citri didn't depend on the master key alone. The King of Pride, who had an overwhelming army, did not appear himself directly in the last battle. Even now, he didn't reveal himself openly when he had more troops. His action was taken for granted. The King of Pride considered everything other than himself as a tool. He would be satisfied with the outcome if he could wear out the King of Greed and the Queen of Fury in return for sacrificing tens of thousands of northern troops. So, Citri had to exactly find out the location of the King of Pride. By finding him, she had to change the nature of this battle from one between the 2 large forces to one between the kings. Citri knew that the freezing of the northern forces would last only 20 seconds. But do Bifrons and Abrasax know that? Can the King of Pride and the King of Lust detect it? Faced with an unimaginable situation at the moment, the King of Pride had to act. He had to expose himself in order to overcome this difficult situation. Citri gulped in a tense moment. She stared at the battlefield, feeling 1 second was like eternity, and she recognized something at some point. Her heart was pounding. Now the king's mana exploded. Everything screamed at the explosive outburst of mana. The explosion was seen beyond the northern army. Right there, the King of Pride unleashed his power. Erecting as many as 8 horns, he radiated the sins of pride and envy. The Black Giant, the power of the sin of envy, was formed over the head of the Northern Army in the center. The King of Lust could no longer hide his position. Either the king revealed his position by erecting the godly energy of lust. He was in the left wing of the northern forces. This was the right moment. Those who had been waiting for this moment for a massive attack began to move at once. Dragon Lord Ankabloza and 22 ancient dragons opened their mouths immediately. Instead of aiming at the monsters who had stopped on the ground, they let out dragon breath toward the ground. 23 rays of light became a huge one and crossed the northern forces. Regardless of those northern forces who could move or not, Ankablosa's army killed them all. Ankablosa was still far from the King of Pride. Besides, the dragon breath swept through the northern army who were located between them, so when she reached the King of Pride, her power was greatly weakened. The Black Giant of Envy wielded the light of pride to smash the dragon breath at once, but Ankablosa was satisfied with that, because her primary purpose was to open the way for the smooth marching of the southern forces. Roaring loudly, Salami spread his wings of flame. Yongho, Catalina, and Gusion that were on his back gripped Salami's backhandle. Then, Salami got close to the dragon breath in full swing. At the moment, sparks from the breath lit the atmosphere. Salami stopped running when the Black Giant of Envy smashed the dragon breath. With the Black Giant of Envy only dozens of meters away, Salami soared vertically at Yongho's order. Now there was really little time left before the freezing of the northern forces stopped. The Black Giant of Envy saw Salami surging into the sky. The King of Lust also turned his eyes at Salamis' strange movement. But the king had no choice but to look ahead immediately. The King of Lust, the Queen of Fury who traversed the northern armies, shouted at the king in anger. The King of Lust, who had the power of temptation, could not fight his ally. So, the best option would be for him to attack her in the middle of the southern forces. The main role of the Queen of Fury was blocking the King of Lust. She was the only one among the southern forces who could fully overcome the King of Lust's power of temptation. Kaiwan wielded her whipsaw to get rid of those northern forces around the Queen of Fury. Kaiwan's role this time was to assist the Queen. Kaiwan kept the proper distance from the two kings and again swung her whipsword. Instead of looking straight at the King of Lust, Kaiwan looked at the sky where Yongho took off a moment ago. The leadership of the southern forces initially had no intention of making this fight a battle between the two large armies, for there were too many northern forces for them to confront successfully. But they knew they could win this battle by defeating only the King of Pride who commanded the northern army. What was important was not the annihilation of the northern army, but the destruction of the King of Pride. It was difficult for the Queen of Fury to confront the King of Lust alone. It was also hard for Yongho to fight the King of Pride alone. The king's mana was more powerful than Yongho's. So, Yongho had to devise a way to make up for his lacing mana and support the numerically inferior southern forces. When Salami soared high enough, Yongho raised Mammon's godly energy, the magic field. Then he issued an order, emitting 12 lights that symbolized his subordinate spirits. Come to me, Labyrinth of Greed. He was referring to something he found in a secret room on the 13th floor, the deepest place of the Labyrinth of Greed. He could do it because he became the true master of the Labyrinth of Greed. Magnodon, who beat the earth, said clearly that he had moved the Labyrinth of Greed and that he hid it right under the ground floor of the House of Mammon. If so, what about the opposite? Would it be possible to move the Labyrinth of Greed back to its place again? Lucia responded. The unimaginable grand magic, which was completed over the course of 1,000 years, a great miracle, had come true. A huge dungeon jumped between space and time. It was a huge dungeon with 13 floors. It was hundreds of meters high, and its width was also beyond imagination. A huge, weird lump of strange rocks was summoned in the middle of the northern forces, which smashed those around the stormy, swirling rocks, the Labyrinth of Greed. The King of Pride screamed loudly, to which the King of Lust had no choice but to turn his eyes. The Queen of Fury was charging at him right before his eyes, but he could not suppress his impulse. The Dungeon of Mammon, the King of Greed. It was the very dungeon he believed had been completely destroyed 1,000 and several hundred years ago by the three kings of pride, envy, and lust. Salami shrieked loudly over the Labyrinth of Greed. Yongho felt the same sense of security like when he was located deep in the Labyrinth of Greed. He once again ordered, "Lucia, Labyrinth of Greed, assist your master." When the master became strong, the dungeon also became strong. When the dungeon became strong, its master became strong as well. The power of the dungeon was the power of its master. Therefore, the master could bring up his strongest power when he was in the dungeon. An aura of great power arose from the Labyrinth of Greed. Yong-ho empowered the entire southern army as well as the Mammon family spirits within that aura. It was as if the entire battlefield became the Labyrinth of Greed. The dungeon breathed with the dungeon spirits. They delivered the strongest power to the master of the dungeon. Yong-ho jumped off the back of Salami. He spread his black magical wings widely, Catalina's power, then encircled his body with the power he received from the Labyrinth of Greed, grasping Ammon, who became united with the godly energy of greed. Yong-ho stared at the black giant of envy standing in front of him, and the king of pride inside it, the king of greed. Chapter 283, Mammon 7. The king of pride shouted at Yong-ho violently. The moment the king faced Yong-ho, he knew it immediately. He didn't even need to check his heartbeat. He saw a vision of Mammon right before his eyes. He even felt the three sins of greed, gluttony, and fury, which Mammon had obtained 1,000 years ago. And that fact evaporated the king's reason and drove him into irresistible anger. The king of pride. Yong-ho wasn't scared at all. He brought out all the power of the king of pride, who possessed the most powerful mana in the history of the demon world, with himself pitted against the king's own royal family. Yong-ho immediately activated all his power at once. The sins of greed, gluttony, and fury instantly became one in his soul. The king of pride erected 8 horns of light over his head. Yong-ho also erected 8 horns of light. The king of pride spread 6 wide wings of light, while Yong-ho spread the wings of black mana. The hugely destructive power of the two kings' mana collided head-on. It seemed as if the whole earth would be split because of the big collision of the two powerful kings. Indeed, the ferocious clash between the two mighty kings was beyond description. The fighting on the ground had become a mess. Those who were near the place where the two kings' mana collided with each other were crushed as if they were caught between huge walls, regardless of whether they were the northern or southern forces. Not only small humanoid monsters such as goblins and imps, but also even medium-sized monsters such as ogres and trolls could not avoid the fate of being crushed to death. Even the giant beasts in the air fell to the ground, hit hard by the two kings' mana. Demon God. It was indeed like God's power. They could not help but look at the two kings' fierce fighting. Even those dungeon spirits who got frozen by the master key of the dungeon market rolled their eyes. Hundreds of thousands of the northern and southern troops' eyes looked at the sky at the same time. They were just absorbed into watching their battle breathlessly, as if they forgot how to even breathe. With everybody on the ground overwhelmed by the fighting in the air, the Queen of Fury had a horn in her mouth. Instead of attacking the King of Lust, she blew the horn as hard as he could. Her horn was like the sound of awakening the southern forces. The Queen of Fury was aware that Citri had only 10 or more seconds left to freeze the northern forces. To ensure the survival and return of even one more southern soldier, she had to defeat the northern forces right now. It was a cruel and selfish idea. But she was the head of the 8 clans. The huge silence was broken by her blowing the horn loudly. It was the heads of the 8 clans who came to their senses first. Tear them off. Biryubakcha, the head of the Garura clan, issued an order. The armed warriors who had been trained to protect their oppressed and abused race for many years responded immediately. Without wasting even 1 second, they attacked the northern forces around them. It was just a few seconds, but during that short span of time, lots of changes took place throughout the battlefield. The Dragon Corps, including Dragon Lord Ankablosa, no longer looked at the King of Pride. Each of them prepared the best possible attack on their own. They were ready to wipe out the flying monsters and beasts of the northern army positioned in the sky. Lucia was located in the Labyrinth of Greed, not Tiamat, the giant red dragon, and unleashed the power of the greatest dungeon freely in its deepest room. As a result, a larger aura injected power into the entire southern army. Citri counted the remaining time until the freezing was lifted. For now, she had only several seconds. Yong-ho and the King of Pride were staring at each other. The Queen of Fury and the King of Lust already started exchanging attacks with each other. Ankablosa filled her mouth with dragon breath, and several ancient dragons of the Dragon Legion were fully ready to use the secret weapon of demon magic. Samael's fatal blow broke the magic field of Abrasax, while Elagos and Ophelia destroyed Bifron's magic at once. The moment Citri finished counting down the time, dragon breath filled the whole sky. A lightning storm, a rain of fire from the sky, and an earthquake that shook the earth swept through the Northern Army. The Northern forces were killed as soon as the dragon soldiers used the demon magic at once. Even though the Master Key didn't work anymore, the Northern forces could not come up with a quick counterattack because it took time for them to recognize that their freezing was lifted. But the moment they realized it, they were faced with the permanent freezing without even screaming when the Southern forces didn't miss the golden chance to attack them. Yong-ho and the King of Pride no longer stared at each other. He rushed, and the king swung his hands wide inside the black giant of envy. The light of pride from the black giant's both hands blocked him. The green flames of Aemon collided with the light. Their fighting was no longer going on in a physical realm. It was only the difference in what form their mana was released. The sin of gluttony devoured the light of pride. The remnant light was burned by the sin of greed. Yong-ho, who strengthened himself with the sin of fury, threw himself at the black giant of envy. By wielding Aemon violently, he tore apart the black giant, a lump of terrible emotions. King of Pride, Abrasax shouted at him. Right after he screamed, however, he had to look back. He couldn't afford to look back at the King of Pride at the moment. The fastest wing, Samael, was the fastest among the 5 directors of the dungeon market. It was impossible for Abrasax to avoid her attack while looking at the King of Pride. All he could do was to simply pour out enormous mana to fill all directions with a magical field. Orobas' absence at the moment was so painful to him. Among the 3 betrayers of the dungeon market, Orobas was the only one who could effectively defeat Samael. Damn it. It was useless, even if he tried to crush her with the overwhelming mana itself. Samael, who became the subordinate spirit of the King of Greed, was so different from her days as one of the 5 directors. His mana that didn't target her exactly strayed from her mana. Abrasax now felt impatient. Born with enormous mana from birth, he did not know how to fight other than crushing his opponent with his mana. Bifrons would have tied up Samael's feet by combining various magic, but Abrasax couldn't. For the first time, he found himself on the defensive, and he was so embarrassed by the deadly attack by a woman who he always thought was inferior to him. As a result, he could not even use half of his power. The number of horns in battle is not absolute. That was what Gushun said before Samael agreed. Once again, she disappeared from Abrasax's sight and aimed at his back. Now Bifrons felt his final moment was coming. His old friend devised several survival options for him, but he came to the same conclusion at the end of the day. He activated 4 kinds of magic by fidgeting with his 4 hands, but the situation did not improve. Tigrius, the wizard of the Mammon family, cancelled out his magics by triggering different magic with both hands, and the 2 beasts of the Mammon family crushed or endured Bifron's magics by mounting a reckless attack. Elagos and Ophelia's attack was so strong and fast that Bifrons could not take the time to prepare another magic. The magics he improvised at the moment could not counter the simultaneous attack by the 3 subordinate spirits of the Mammon family. The subordinate spirits of the King of Lust could not go to help Bifrons. All they could do was to protect the forces of the King of Gluttony from the onslaught of the Southern Army. Moreover, the subordinate spirits of the Mammon family were much more than expected. Richard, the silent warrior, broke his long silence. He roared loudly and smashed the forces of the King of Lust. He was second only to Gusion, who was said to be the strongest fighter among Mammon's 12 spirits. Accordingly, there was nobody among the King of Lust's forces who could confront Richard. It was like a tiger moving around in the flock of sheep. Each time he swung his black club, those soldiers around him were shattered to pieces. Skathash showed off her infinite vitality. She wasn't content with treating the wounded soldiers of the Southern Army. She broke into the Northern forces to prove why she was called the Immortal Witch. There were no attacks that inflicted a fatal injury to her, who had transcendental regenerative power. Scathach, who dealt with the power of life, attacked the Northern army in her own way, whenever the blue wave struck them. The Northern soldiers who received excessive vitality from her saw their bodies bursting out. Some of them lose their lives because dozens of arms sprouted from the wounded areas. Skullcall. The Skull unit was already a battlefield nightmare to the Northern forces. Skull, the incarnation of death, was not satisfied with sprinkling death everywhere. The dead stood up and followed the Skulls, advancing ferociously. The more the Northern forces were killed, the more they followed the Skull unit. Bucephalus let out a green breath. Not content with rushing forward, he destroyed those who stood in his way. He brilliantly carried out his mission, befitting his image as the King of Nightmare. Both life and death were the enemies of the Northern forces. They fell into extreme confusion and fear now. Some of them couldn't move even now, as if they felt they were frozen. The King of Pride didn't care about the Northern army from the beginning. The King of Lust could not take care of them. Abrasax and Bifrons couldn't waste even a second, only focusing on surviving. The Southern forces were united and strong, while the Northern forces were in disarray without any central leadership. The nature of the battle quickly transformed from an intense fighting into a war of slaughter. I belong to Yong-ho. I belong to Yong-ho. Shouting loudly, Chwiryong swung her whipsword in all directions. While slaughtering the Northern forces with the storm of her sword, she tried to see elsewhere other than the King of Lust. Chapter 284, Mammon 8. The power of temptation of the King of Lust was indeed very strong. Chwiryong could understand why no one except for the Queen of Fury, with the same sins and godly energies, could confront the King of Lust. It was difficult for him to endure the power of greed through Brigada. Even the power of passion Chwiryong inherited from Magnodon did not help much. Chwiryong wanted to help the King of Lust. She wanted to kiss the top of his feet. She wanted to be held in the king's arms. She wanted to listen to whatever the king told her to do. She was willing to bark if the king wanted her to. She felt happy when she bowed to the king and obeyed him. Bullshit, Yong-ho is mine. Chwiryong fought off all those delusions by thinking of Yong-ho whenever she was seduced by the King of Lust. She was the one chosen by Eustia among the subordinate spirits of the House of Mammon as the one who could best resist the king's temptation. Catalina couldn't resist the King of Lust, since the blood of a succubus was flowing in half of her body. It was none other than Chwiryong who had the most affection for Yong-ho among the remaining subordinate spirits. Aha! It's my determination as his official wife. Chwiryong shouted again desperately, then empowered her whipsword. She distorted the space itself, so no Northern forces could approach the King of Lust and Queen of Fury. The Queen of Fury heard Chwiryong shouting desperately. She wanted to refute or deny it, but she couldn't afford it. Maybe she didn't even think about it. Are you going to hit me? No, because it hurts, don't do it. Just love me. The power of temptation of the King of Lust was so strong. Sins and godly energies neutralized the power of other sins, but didn't offset them. The King of Lust had lived for at least 1,000 years. Given how long the king possessed the power of sin, the Queen of Fury was no match for the king. The queen was far inferior to the king in terms of the ability to understand and use the sins and godly energies. The Queen of Fury put up with it by clenching her teeth. She thought of hundreds of thousands of tribesmen of her 8 clans, who committed suicide, succumbing to the temptation of the King of Lust. Finally, the queen brought out the sin of fury more intensely with anger, and remembered Yong-ho's love while relying on the mana of greed through the Brigada ring, Kwaya. The Queen of Fury gave a cry. At that moment, the godly energy of lust in the shape of a long sword broke the queen's powerful thruster weapon. It did not stop there, leaving a sharp sword wound on the white and soft skin of the queen. The Queen of Fury was often called a war fanatic because she had experienced so many battles. She had been the hope of the 8 clans since she was born, so she went through rigorous martial arts training since childhood to become the best warrior of her people. But she was not a match for the King of Lust. In short, the King of Lust was a sword demon. He was already called the best swordsman in the demon world 1,000 years ago. Although the Queen of Fury was a famed war veteran, she could not confront the king alone. Let's try to gain as much time as possible. That's all I have to focus on right now. I have to trust Yong-ho, my love. The Queen of Fury relied on the Sin of Fury, which made its owner stronger as she became more furious. Although she was inferior to the king in terms of mana and skills, she outpowered the king in terms of her Herculean power and defensive power. The Queen of Fury blocked the attack by the king with her body literally. The role of the Queen of Fury was to gain time for Yong-ho. If Yong-ho defeated the King of Pride, it meant the victory of the entire Southern Army. Of course, the best scenario would be for the Queen of Fury to defeat the King of Lust, then help Yong-ho fight the King of Pride, but that was more than she could chew. The Queen of Fury clenched her teeth and swung her fists endlessly. Thanks to the way she fought in battle, marked by her relentless attack without stopping, the Queen could make up for her inferior strength compared with the King of Lust. Just like the Queen was struggling to put up with the difficult situation, the King could not overpower her as easily as he thought. The godly energy of fury, which looked like a beast's teeth, bit off the air. The King of Lust managed to avoid the attack by jumping off the ground. Then, after narrowing the distance with the Queen, the King approached her from the side and swung the godly energy of lust violently. The King's swift attack while jumping down from the sky was beautiful. The Queen hurriedly twisted her body and avoided the godly energy of lust. But the long sword passed barely over her shoulders and chest, leaving a long scar on her white skin once again. The Queen of Fury and the King of Lust looked at each other. The Queen pulled her fist, and the King withdrew his sword surprisingly quickly. However, their actions were far from their attack against each other. As if they promised to do so, they stepped back at the same time. Both of them looked up at the sky, with their hearts pounding hard. There were cracks all over the sky. The celestial door was opened. Even after 1,000 years, nobody could find out exactly where the celestial hole was opened. In some cases, the celestial hole was opened in an unexpected place, and in other cases, it opened and disappeared in the land where no one lived. However, it did not mean that the celestial beings could not fully control where to open the celestial hole. The more widely the celestial door was opened, the more aggressively they opened the celestial hole, just like they chose a city or an army garrison instead of a land with nobody or nothing. Yuno and Eustia, who belonged to the non-combat series among Mammon's 12 spirits, stood on the deck of the giant red dragon Tiamat and looked down at the sky. Eustia's cards were listed in the air automatically, indicating the number and size of the celestial holes. There were already 5 holes in the celestial world that were already open and opening at this moment. It was different from the last battle. It was not a situation where the southern and northern forces could withdraw their forces. They had to fight the celestial world in a situation where the two forces were entangled. They were already ready for it when they witnessed the appearance of a couple of super-sized godly men. After taking back the stack of cards, Eustia snapped her fingers to leap into the room where the core of the giant red dragon Tiamat was located. The best they could do was to lend whatever power they had to the labyrinth of greed. Through Tiamat, Yuno remembered her memory 1,000 years ago. Just thinking about it made her shudder. She was breathing more and more roughly. It will be different this time. It will be different. Eustia said that, and Yuno nodded. The celestial door was not fully open yet. Yuno, who counted the stars, prayed for Mammon, the king of greed. Together with Eustia, she delivered all of her mana to the labyrinth of greed. A super-large godly man stuck his head out of the hole. His black eyes were even more terrifying, because his whole body was covered with white light. There were 5 celestial holes, and the super-large godly men stuck their heads out of the 4 of them. Celestial beings wrapped in grey light were coming out of the one remaining hole toward the earth, as if water was pouring out. The northern forces were in extreme confusion. One of the generals in charge of them could not even swear, overwhelmed by fear. He was just thinking of stopping the fight and running away from the battlefield. The southern army was also agitated because they witnessed what the super-large godly men had done in the last battle. Skull, who was smashing the northern forces at the forefront of the southern army, quickly turned his head. He made up his mind, watching the super-large godly man who came out of the hole. After entrusting the Skull unit to the Death Knights, he jumped off the ground. Bucephalus, carrying Skull on his back, soared into the air and rushed toward the super-sized godly man. The celestial power emanating from the super-sized godly man was rushing toward Skull like a storm. but Skull cut off the power of the celestial world by wielding Baphomet's sickle with the wicked energy of purple light. Then he tore it apart with the powerful mana and opened the way Skull called. Skull was determined to defeat one godly man from the celestial world. Watching him from a distance, Beryubakcha, the head of the Garura clan, came to his senses. He hastily issued a new order. Surround yourselves with mana. Prepare for celestial power. Unlike the disorderly northern forces, the southern forces were in good shape and fully prepared for the fight. Although they witnessed the celestial doors, they were not overwhelmed with fear. The power of the celestial world is coming. Be prepared for its shock. Shouting like that, Lucia sprinkled the power of the labyrinth of greed over the heads of the southern army. The aura that empowered the southern forces now became a barrier to the celestial power. Some of the northern forces right under the hole were killed at once, without even giving a cry, "Help me! Help me!" Some of the northern forces abandoned their weapons and jumped into the southern army. Most of them were killed by the southern forces wielding their swords, but some of them survived. The southern army remained cool-hearted even at this moment. Because of this, they could not completely turn away the northern forces stricken with fear and shock. Even though they were fighting against each other, they tried to keep the gentleman's agreement in an urgent and dangerous situation like this. Leave the northern forces alone. Just prepare for the godly men. Just keep your position, Beryubakcha issued another order. The battle between the godly men wrapped in white light and the southern army finally began. Chwiryong cursed at them. While looking for a chance to help Yong-ho, who was in the thick of fighting the King of Pride, he turned his head. Two godly men appeared from a hole in the sky. They weren't as huge as those from the other four holes, but they were even more dangerous. They were none other than the godly generals. Chapter 285. Mammon 9. Ankabloza roared. She let out dragon breath toward one of the godly generals who appeared above the southern army's head. The dragons around her also fired wide area mana toward the godly men in succession. Although they mocked the magics of the demon world thanks to the power of the celestial world, they could not block it when the magics were overlapped. The dragon corps secured their own territory in the sky. The monsters nosedived to the ground. It was really a terrifying spectacle to watch dozens of monsters plunging to the ground with their bodies entangled with dozens of godly men. The battlefield, which was a mess because of the clash between the northern and southern forces, fell into even greater chaos, and their mana collided with each other in the center of all this chaos. Yong-ho and the King of Pride did not hide their murderous intentions toward each other. Basically, mana on both sides was too powerful. Whenever Aemon's godly energy collided with that of the King of Pride, heaven and earth shook. There were huge craters deep down in the ground, while there wasn't a single cloud left in the sky. The King of Greed, King of Greed, King of Greed. Laughing loudly, the King of Pride wielded the godly energy of pride against Yong-ho. Whenever he wielded the godly energy of pride in the shape of a huge sword of light, a tremendous amount of mana moved with it. The movement of their mana itself was much more threatening than the king's sword attack itself. Since the king's sword attack was not simple, Yong-ho had no choice but to face it with mana. The godly energies of Ammon and the King of Pride collided again, but Yong-ho clenched his teeth. His arm holding Aemon's godly energy was so painful as to be torn off, but he endured it with all his might. The King of Pride laughed again. He suffered a lot of damage every time he exchanged attacks with Yong-ho, but he couldn't hide his gladness. Yong-ho had more sins than the king, but he was inferior to the king in terms of the total amount of mana and physical strength. The more intensely they fought, the more pronounced this kind of difference between the two was. The demon world itself. The demon world itself. The King of Pride shouted violently at Yong-ho. He had lived for thousands of years. His body, which he had completed over the past 1,000 years, was the crystal of the demon world. The King of Pride decided that he would not lose to Yong-ho with the blood of the alien world. In his mind, the strongest one in the demon world was pride, not greed. Master Ammon screamed. Yong-ho vomited blood. The tight balance of power between the two was finally broken. Although Yong-ho managed to block the King of Pride's sword attack, he could not stop the mana the king unleashed right after that. When the King of Pride added a new power to the godly energy of pride, that was pressing down Ayaman's spear. Yong-ho fell helplessly. He plunged to the ground at a tremendous speed. "You're done." The king of pride cursed at him blatantly. The sin of envy, which became stronger in proportion to the intensity of its owner's feelings, pursued him. The black smoke wrapped around the king of pride quickly took shape as a black giant, who then swung his huge fist toward Yong-ho, who fell to the ground. Kwa-a-a-a-kang. Heaven and earth were shaken at the same time. Yong-he screamed, then he vomited blood. Yong-ho's mana blocked his fist but failed to push it out. It was still being held down by his power. At that moment, the green flames arose to burn the dark feelings of envy. The sin of gluttony ate up the mana of pride ferociously. However, that was not enough. It was too difficult to reverse the dynamics that had once tilted in favor of the king of pride. Yong-ho Kaiwan screamed. As his subordinate spirit, she immediately recognized the danger her master was in, but there was nothing she could do. Although she raced toward Yong-ho and the king of pride, she was still far away from them. Besides, the king's mana in the surrounding area blocked her approach. The queen of fury also wanted to help Yong-ho, but the king of lust did not allow it. The king decided to hold the queen rather than overpowering her. Catalina turned boldly in spite of the possible attack by the godly general behind her back. But her two alter egos of dark mana blocked his attack. She regarded her body as a single sword. She collected black mana in order to penetrate the king of pride's mana. Yong-ho's other subordinate spirits also realized their master was in danger. However, there were very few of them who could leave their location, unlike Catalina and Kaiwan Skull. Skull left a trace of death on the godly man's huge neck. Then he passed by the killed godly man to run toward the place where Yong-ho was. Eligos and Ophelia stabbed Bifronza's chest for the 7th time, then turned their heads to Yong-ho immediately. Master Gusion screamed, Richard roared, Scathar shouted desperately. Citri stepped forward while the three were screaming. Yong-ho felt his heart was beating. It was the moment when he was on the verge of death, but he knew it. The Queen of Fury and the King of Lust also knew it. The Queen was gasping for breath, while the King of Lust felt pain and urgency at the same time. The King of Pride, who was showing intense hatred toward Yong-ho, turned his head. Actually, he had to, because he suddenly felt his heart was pounding. The Queen of Sloth, Citri, who stood by Mammon to the end and watched his last moment. The King of Pride. Citri's soul was poisoned by the power of the celestial world. She'd been keeping the power of sloth for over 1,000 years, but she was the weakest in terms of fighting. So, it was reckless for her to challenge the King of Pride with 8 horns. Nonetheless, she acted. The King of Pride felt threatened by the Queen of Sloth. She jumped over space and stepped on the air. She approached him from the side. The invisible barrier of corrosion that originated from the power of sloth pushed out the king's mana and opened a way. As the distance between them narrowed, the strength of the invisible barrier of corrosion increased. More Citri Kaiwan slowed down before she knew it. For the first time, Catalina realized that she was the reincarnation of a Lune. She noticed one fact when she looked at Citri from behind. The dark energy of envy enveloped Citri before being dismantled and disappeared. Normally, Citri could never have done it, but the King of Pride understood it. That was why he concentrated his power to disrupt Citri's attack instead of Yong-ho. The invisible barrier of corrosion opened the way to the King of Pride by breaking his mana through the magic of pride. The power of sin was the power of the soul. Citri burned her own soul. She was completely different from when she confronted the 3 directors who betrayed her. She wanted to survive back then, but not now. She would die where she was standing. She planned to bite the king's neck by exhaling the power of sloth as much as possible. The King of Pride was already like a demon god. Even if Citri burned all her soul, she could never destroy him. But she could deal a fatal blow to him so that Yong-ho could stand up again and confront him. She believed that Yong-ho could overpower the weakened king and destroy him at the end of the day. She knew she was content with her role like that. By doing so, she could save the demon world. Citri Yong-ho shouted from the ground, trying to stop her. But she didn't listen. She took another step forward. Now, she recalled Mammon, throwing herself toward the King of Pride, who was about to use all his might to disrupt her attack. Smiling at Yong-ho for the last time, she brought out as much power of sloth as possible. There arose a beautiful and enormous flame caused by her sacrificing herself. The flame didn't flare up, but it faded away instead. The King of Pride was not responsible for it, nor was Chwiryong shouting stopped it. He could not tolerate her sacrifice. His will and shouting finally awakened Yong-ho again. The resonance of the 7 deadly sins gathered in one place awakened him from his long sleep. He could never sit idle, watching her sacrificing herself before his eyes. I won't allow for it because you are mine, and your soul is mine. The moment the invisible barrier of corrosion was removed, Chitri bounced off, pushed out by the king's mana. Catalina caught her in the air. The two looked at her, aghast. Tears came down Chitri's eyes. The King of Pride shuddered. He felt scared before he knew it. He barely spoke. It's a lie. The Queen of Fury was thrilled. The King of Lust couldn't even breathe properly. Gusion shouted loudly while Yong-ho's 12 subordinate spirits also screamed, "My king!" Yong-ho and Mammon, the unified king of greed, responded to their shouting the day when Mammon, the king of greed, disappeared from the demon world. On that day, 1,000 and hundreds of years ago, Mammon closed the door of the celestial world and died, totally emaciated. The King of Pride thought so, and Mammon's 12 spirits also thought likewise. But the King of Greed never died that way. Yong-ho felt and understood it. Counting the stars, told him that he was not the reincarnation of Mammon, but that Mammon was always with him. She wasn't talking about Mammon's legacy. What saw was more essential. Mammon, who killed numerous godly men, finally shut the celestial door. Although he was exposed to tremendous celestial power, he was still the greatest king of the demon world. Chitri, the queen of sloth who stood by him to the end, met Mammon. He made the following request to her who was weeping. "Kill me with your power." Mammon in her arms was like a bomb. His body contained a large amount of celestial power beyond imagination. He could not control it with his mana anymore. The moment Mammon breathed his last breath, the power of the celestial world would grow explosively, which would inflict another irreparable damage to the demon world. So, Mammon asked her to erase him from the demon world along with the power of the celestial world. By using her invisible barrier of corrosion, Mammon would shortly face his last moment, and he was destined to die anyway. Nonetheless, his request was so cruel to her. Chitri hugged him with trembling hands. Then, she activated the invisible barrier of corrosion to accept his request and ended his life. At that moment, her soul was poisoned by the celestial power, and she had an indelible wound deep down. The reason why he could meet Amon as soon as he started exploring the dungeon. The voice he heard while he was peeking into Skathak's memories. His memory of Mammon in the human world. Why had not there been a successor born for the past 1,000 years since Mammon's death? What happened to the sin of greed during those years? And why did Chitri not get the power of greed, gluttony, and fury? Yong-ho could understand all of them now. Mammon did something for the last time before he died in Chitri's arms. He could do it because Chitri's power of the invisible barrier of corrosion neutralized the celestial power. The 7 deadly sins were the fragments of the demon god's soul. Mammon, the king of greed, did not let go of the sin of greed. He owned it by himself, which became the sin of greed itself over 1,000 years. Yong-ho felt Mammon, he was greed, which was with himself. It already became united with him. He stepped forward. He jumped over space and stood next to Chitri and Catalina. Holding the crying Chitri in his arms, he unleashed the godly energy of greed. The power of the godly energy of greed was possessiveness. The King of Pride raised his head. He couldn't understand what was happening before his eyes, but he acted instinctively. He swung the mana of pride to stop the King of Greed and gathered the light of pride and the black energy of envy to attack him. But it was too late. Yong-ho hugged Chitri so hard as to almost crush her. He possessed her to accept her body and soul. Devouring the celestial power that poisoned her, he declared the contract on making Chitri his 13th subordinate spirit. The demon god's heart within him began to pound. The 7th claw broke into Yong-ho's chest. The 4 sins of greed, gluttony, fury, and sloth became one in Yong-ho's soul. All 8 horns of light that sprouted above Yong-ho's head disappeared. It was impossible to measure his power by the number of horns. The light of pride and the black smoke of envy scattered, and the celestial power evaporated. Everyone on the battlefield forgot to fight. Even the celestial beings were forced to stop and look. The king of greed, rather, the demon god of greed, Yong-ho, grabbed Aemon and fired up the flames of greed. He looked down at the king of pride. Chapter 286, Demon God. Coincidence and inevitability met, giving birth to the present situation. Mammon, who became united with greed over the course of 1,000 years, could no longer be called a human being. However, Yong-ho felt Mammon's will. He was now with Yong-ho himself. It was a battlefield where hundreds of thousands of people gathered together, but there was no sound of them even swallowing. It was as if the whole world stopped. 4 sins gathered in one place, Mammon's godly energy that united the powers of different sins. The heart of the demon god that guided the power of the owner's soul to a higher place. The king of pride opened his mouth, but he couldn't speak properly. Although he had the mana as powerful as that of God, he never thought of wielding it. He just got frozen with the shock that he met a much more powerful being than him. Yong-ho looked down at the king and lifted Mammon's godly energy, guided by Mammon's whispering. He broke the huge silence by shouting at the king, "Own it, labyrinth of greed." Lucia responded to his shouting. The labyrinth of greed took root in the earth. It didn't just emit an aura, but it owned the surrounding area. It turned the entire battlefield into the labyrinth of greed. The surface of the ground rose and became a wall. The protective walls did not differentiate between the southern and northern forces. They were all inhabitants of the demon world. In other words, they were the people of the demon god. The celestial power that crushed the entire battlefield was pushed back. The demonic beings who were groaning in pain and fear felt calm in the dungeon. Yong-ho's power grew even stronger. As the demon king became stronger, the dungeon also became stronger. The beings of the celestial world rushed to the beings of the demon world, screaming silently. But they were different from before. The demonic beings located inside the dungeon were no longer helplessly destroyed by the power of the celestial world. A fierce battle broke out in both heaven and earth. Bifrost smiled. With his heart destroyed by the mighty attacks of Eligos and Ophelia, he could not continue living. It was impossible for him to even say a few words. But he was satisfied, although he made the wrong choice. And it was impossible for him to see clearly what was happening before his eyes. He knew that the demon world would become one. He also knew his longing would come true. Instead of giving a fatal blow to Bifrost, Eligos ran toward Yong-ho. Ophelia also ran next to Eligos. Tigreus also did not look back. Abrasax denied reality. He had 7 horns. He was called the strongest mana of the dungeon market. But why was he so powerless now? Samael did not answer. She withdrew the sword that pierced his back and heart. She turned around and looked at her master. She spread her fastest wings wide and soared into the sky. Richard smashed the godly general's head. He opened his mouth amid the scattering light. Instead of shouting, he made articulate words for the first time. My king, Eustia and Juno cried in the labyrinth of greed. Scathach smiled after laughing. Gusion burst into laughter loudly. The king of lust sat down helplessly. He barely breathed. He then shed a stream of tears. It wasn't just because he accumulated regrets for more than 1,000 years. With a tearful voice, he cried, Belial, the king of pride. The king of lust, disguised as a woman, had been loving the king for several thousands of years. Ah, her. The king of pride screamed. By shouting like that, the king gathered mana once more. Then he radiated the light of pride, which was the power of his presence, and the dark energy of envy, which was a lump of terrible emotions. It was 1,000 years. The king of pride recreated his body in the best shape as much as he could over the past 1,000 years, so he was far superior to Mamonov, the past. But why was he defeated? Don't look down on me like that, the king of pride shouted. His mana was really powerful, so much so that he could be called the demon god. But his opponent was a tough challenger. Yong-ho unleashed his remaining fury. He swung Armon violently, arousing the green flames of greed. Yong-ho's mana devoured the king's mana. The green flames, which contained not only greed, but also the power of gluttony, burned the light of pride and the dark energy of envy. The power of sloth cancelled out the aftermath of the collision, and the power of fury empowered Yong-ho. Yong-ho pierced through the green flames. He swung Aemon violently once again to strike the king strongly, but the king hurriedly lifted the godly energy of pride and stopped his attack. Their eyes met while they were wielding their swords and spears. Now, the situation was unfolding differently from before. The king of pride could not withstand Yong-ho's power as well as the demon king's power anymore. The king vomited blood. Once again, their spears and swords clashed in the air. Yong-ho discovered how the king of pride acquired the mana as it was now. He witnessed countless souls howling inside the king's soul. The king of pride spread its 6 wings wide, but it was useless. Each time Yong-ho swung Aemon, his wide wings were broken one by one. Obviously, the king's mana was so powerful as to shake heaven and earth. Yong-ho's power was stronger. The king of greed. The king of pride screamed, confronting his despair, jealousy, and anger. Yong-ho injected strength into Mammon's godly energy. Then he condensed all the power of his 12 subordinate spirits, as well as those in the dungeon. My master, Aemon responded. Yong-ho felt everyone in the endlessly growing power. Demon God. He was the only master of the demon world. He was the man who ruled the dungeon named the demon world. Aemon broke the godly energy of pride, and Aemon's green flames burned everything that stood in the way. His final blow pierced the king's heart. The king of pride saw Yong-ho. He opened his lips and said something he couldn't even think of before. The moment he was facing his last moment, he could think of only one name that occupied his mind. Asmodeus. It was the name of the king of lust who had loved him alone for several thousand years. Aemon's green flames burned the king of pride. Yong-ho reached out and grabbed the king's essence. Pride and envy, the 2 sins. The sin of greed was empowered at the moment and owned it all. 6 out of the 7 deadly sins had gathered together. The king of lust no longer resisted. He put everything down and left himself to the natural attraction. The 7 deadly sins were originally one. So, the sin of lust wanted to be united with other sins. The sin of lust now belonged to the king of greed. The king of lust, disguised as a woman, fell on the floor and cried. He was the only one in the world who would cry for the king of pride. The celestial beings attacking the southern and northern forces stopped attacking and headed for the sky. They did so to preserve their power, but they were instinctively scared of the incredible power of the demon god. Not only the celestial men, but also the godly generals headed to the sky, and new celestial holes began to open high in the sky. Yong-ho stood at the highest place in the labyrinth of greed. Although he defeated the king of pride, he had to conquer the celestial door. Today's fight was not over yet. The red sky was turning blue, which was evidence that the celestial door was opening. The vortex of mana created by the clash between Yong-ho and the king of pride prompted the celestial door to open. Yong-ho recognized it through Mammon's memory. It was a coincidence that Mammon left his offspring in the human world. Maybe even that was guided by his fate, but he didn't think so. Mammon visited the human world again shortly before the final battle with the celestial world. He did so to prepare for the possible collapse of the demon world, just in case he could not block the attack of the celestial world. Mammon looked for his descendants in the human world and gave them the heart of the demon god. If one day a qualified person was born, he would own the heart of the demon god. More than 1,000 years have passed. Finally, a new king of greed appeared, and he obtained the heart of the demon god and Mammon's godly energy. By collecting all the 7 deadly sins, he rose to the level of the true demon god. And now, the celestial door was opened in front of him. The celestial world was the worst alien world to the demon world. The existence itself was the opposite of the demon world, so it constantly longed for the demon world. Even Mammon did not know clearly about the celestial world. However, when he looked into the celestial world through its door, he was convinced that he should not be merely content with shutting down the door itself. This time, he had to cut off the connection between the celestial world and the demon world by using his power as the demon king. The 12 subordinate spirits of the past and present gathered by Yong-ho's side. Although the celestial door was opening in the sky, none of them expressed fear. Salami landed next to Yong-ho. He flinched a bit at the overwhelming presence of Yong-ho, who became the demon god, but soon he wagged his tail as always. Yong-ho looked at the sky. He saw the stars he had seen in his memory many times. It was another evidence that the celestial power was getting stronger again. Skull, Skull said. Yong-ho turned at his calling and smiled before he knew it. Above the entrance to the first floor of the Labyrinth of Greed, Uriah, Baduk, and the dungeon meerkat stood, gasping for breath. Behind him were standing not only Rickham and Bergrim, but also the Goblin Rangers. Also behind them was Triant, who was waddling up the stairs. Uriah did not know what kind of fighting took place today. She didn't know who Yong-ho was going to fight from now on, but she guessed that his fighting was different this time. The place Yong-ho was going to head for now was a really dangerous place. Maybe he would never come back. Uriah held back the urge to burst into crying before she knew it. She looked up at him, then laughed reluctantly while fiddling with the chicken voucher in her hand. She bowed to him and said, "Bye." Baduk and the meerkat also bowed. Rickham and Bergrim also bowed to him, while the Goblin Rangers and Triant, who arrived late, did the same. Lucia was seated next to Uriah. She, the soul of the dungeon as well as Yong-ho's alter ego, nodded to him instead of speaking long. Watching them, Yong-ho laughed. He stroked Lucia's hair and sat down before Uriah at her eye level. He said, holding her hand tightly, "I will be back. Let's eat chicken together when I come back." Uriah nodded. Eventually, she shed tears. He wiped her tears off and stood up again. Lucia smiled like a grown-up. "Bye, Tim." "My master, king of the demon world," Yong-ho turned. He looked up at the stairs leading to the celestial door. Then, this time, 12 subordinate spirits spoke one by one. "I, Endorion's daughter, Ophelia, will be with you, master of the great Mammon family. I, the butler, am the last bastion of the dungeon. But this time, I will be the bastion of my master Ophelia," and Iligos stood by Yong-ho's side. Guxian and Skathak said one after another, "I will never let you go alone this time. I told you to fight with your subordinate spirits, right?" At that moment, the godly men and godly generals were coming out in droves from the whole of the celestial world. As they were standing in the place closest to the sky, they could feel the threat directly. However, the 12 subordinate spirits did not stop. Samael and Tigrius quietly stood by Yong-ho, and Richard stood behind Gusion. "I will protect you by sacrificing my life." Catalina flapped her ears and tail. She was always an escort knight guarding him at hand. "Because I am his official wife, let me forgive you for using me as the shield against the attack." Then Kaiwan hugged Yong-ho's arm. "Because you are my master as well as the king of the 8 clans, I'll be with you. Besides, I have to hold a wedding ceremony with you after the fight." Britarashutta, the Queen of Fury, blushed and spoke a little timidly. Skull laughed and stood at the forefront. Yong-ho finally looked at one person next to him. "My beloved customer, I trust you." Citri smiled at him and felt greed that existed within his body. He also smiled at her. Without any further delay, he stepped forward. The stairs leading to the celestial world. It was the path where Mammon, the king of greed, climbed alone and saved the demon world. From heaven and earth, everyone in the demon world looked up at him. The celestial beings looked down from the sky that turned blue. "My master. 2. I will stay with you until the end." Amen. The magic spear of the Red Lotus. He had always been Yong-ho's strong support. Yong-ho opened up the power of the demon god. Heaven and earth shook with his overwhelming mana, which evaporated the celestial energy that was filling the sky. Yong-ho climbed the first staircase by jumping through space. Then he ordered his subordinate spirits, "Let's move." That was the word that Mammon could not say back then. Following the king of greed, they climbed the stairs to the celestial world. Chapter 287. Epilogue 1. The war between the North and the South, which involved the whole demon world, finally ended. The war lasted only 1 month, but its after effects were devastating. When the war between the celestial world and the demon world, followed by the war of the northern and southern forces, was finally over, the changes that the demon world experienced were far greater than all the changes over the last 1,000 years. Samael looked at the collapsed dungeon. Just a few months ago, There were numerous people going in and out of the dungeon, the special auction house of the dungeon market. It was broken and ruined. On its walls and floors were the traces of the day when the special auction house collapsed. Samael clenched her teeth when she found the darkened bloodstains all over the walls. Among the changes caused by the war of the northern and southern forces, the collapse of the dungeon market was most talked about by the busybodies everywhere. Dungeon market completely collapsed. It wasn't because 3 of the 5 directors there were gone. Although they were greatly destroyed, the distribution channels of Dungeon Market were still connected throughout the demon world, and its various production facilities were also in good shape. In fact, since the Dungeon Market monopolized the entire demonic world, there was no competitor to replace it in the event of a crisis. Nonetheless, the Dungeon Market collapsed. The demon world no longer believed the Dungeon Market. But I'm going to build it again. Samael thought of Cirrus' words, slightly lifting her wings. Citri, the founder of the Dungeon Market, shared all the remaining properties of the Dungeon Market with Samael. Citri asked Samael to create a new Dungeon Market. Even if the inhabitants of the demon world do not trust the Dungeon Market, they still needed it in the demon world master. The time is up. When she heard the voice from behind her back, Samael turned around. It was the voice of Incubus Henry, Samael's new butler. He was the younger cousin of Karot, who was killed while defending her dungeon, even though he was overwhelmingly inferior to the enemy in military strength. Sorry. I think I have been delayed too long. Samael was the owner of the new Dungeon Market, but she had only one master. I should not be late. Let's hurry. Today was a special day. Just like Karot, Henry escorted Samael politely. The fastest wing, Samael, who was one of Yong-Ho's 12 subordinate spirits, ascended on a flying wagon heading for the labyrinth of greed. The age of the 6 kings had come to an end. People in the northern area who lost their king fell into great chaos, but only for a brief period. The situation in the northern area soon went back to normal. The unclaimed land in the northern area. It was a place where dozens of housemasters ruled their respective dungeons and competed with each other. However, it was different from the southern land that had been divided over the past 1,000 years, because Yong-Ho existed in the current demon world. He was the one and only greatest king in all the history of the demon world. The masters of the northern area sent their envoys to the south competitively to curry favor with him. Today was a very special day for the entire demon world. The territory of the King of Lust, like the territories of the King of Pride and the King of Envy, became an unclaimed land because of its division. The vassals of the King of Lust kept his dungeon, waiting for the king's return, but the king did not appear before them. The King of Lust was alive. Even now, when both the War of the North and the South, as well as another great war, was over, the soul of the dungeon of the King of Lust was alive. This meant that the dungeon owner, the King of Lust, was alive as Modius, the King of Lust, sword demon. The king who had lived longer than anyone else in the demon world and cherished the sin of lust. The King of Lust had been with lust for so long. It was no exaggeration to say that the king was already the sin of lust. Because of this, even after the war ended, the king still existed like before. In fact, he was similar to the Queen of Fury or the Queen of Sloth, who shared the power of sin with Yong-Ho after they were made his subordinate spirits. Yong-Ho did not kill the King of Lust. Following Mammon's last will, he freed the king. The King of Lust wandered in the wilderness. While wandering aimlessly, the king stopped on a small hill in the north. It was the place where the king first encountered the King of Pride a long time ago. A rough wind blew. The king's snow-white hair was twined around her chest and shoulders. The King of Lust did not resent Yong-Ho. This time, the king didn't have any deep regrets either. She just shed tears for the King of Pride, Belial. That was the name of the King of Pride that Asmodeus, the King of Lust, remembered. The King of Lust did not rush. She waited a little more, facing the blowing wind. She remembered her love for the King of Pride. The war between the celestial world and the demon world lasted 3 days and 3 nights. For this reason, there were some who called the war the 3 Days War. The biggest feature of the war was that all those in the demon world became united as one. The survivors of the southern and northern forces, who had once gathered together to fight against each, joined hands under one flag and fought the celestial world. Although they fought only 3 days, they all became the greatest king's subordinate spirits during the battle. The war made the whole demon world united as one, with the King of Greed as the central leader. The Labyrinth of Greed, which was the great battleground, no longer existed in the center of the demon world because it returned to the place where it was originally supposed to be. Dragons were lazy individualists even now, as they used to be. On the day when the war between the celestial world and the demon world ended, the Dragon Legion was disbanded. As a matter of fact, they could be established because of the absolute charisma of the King of Violence. Now that even the King of Violence's last will was gone, there was no reason to maintain the Dragon Army anymore. Dragon Lord Ankablosa returned to a free blue dragon. While she was goofing off in her own hideout Rare, she woke up at the urging of Dark Elves who were her subordinate spirits. What the heck? The promised day has not come yet. What she complained about was that she had not yet slept for a month when the war was over in less than a month. According to her original schedule, she was supposed to wake up 2 months later than now, on the day when the King of Greed would get married to the Queen of Fury. The Dark Elves trembled and expressed fear at their master's annoying voice. Ankablosa suppressed her anger and asked again with a slightly softened voice, "If you hadn't been crazy, you wouldn't have woken me up for no reason. What happened while I was sleeping?" The Dark Elves nodded. Then they delivered urgent news to Ankablosa, who turned into an Apsaras with long dark blue hair. "We must hurry to return even by ourselves." Tigrius of Harmony, one of Yongho's 12 subordinate spirits, spoke, gently touching Salami's back. The reason why Salami, Yongho's private car, was carrying Tigrius on his back was simple. Yongho ordered Salami to give him a ride, because he could not take a break even after the war was over, who had to lead the Northern Expeditionary Force. When the war was over, the territories of the King of Pride, the King of Envy, and the King of Gluttony became no king's land. The territories of the King of Pride and the King of Envy were located far too far from the land of greed in the south. However, it was not the territory of the King of Gluttony, so Yongho organized a northern expedition with Tigrius as the head Skullcull. Another pillar of the Northern Expedition Force, Skull, responded with a hearty laugh. The Skull unit, which made great achievements in the war with the Celestial World, was advancing at the forefront of the Northern Expedition Force under the feet of Bucephalus running through the sky with Salami. Originally, the Northern Expeditionary Force should have already arrived at the Labyrinth of Greed, but due to unexpected troubles, they didn't arrive on time. If they led the Northern Expedition Force as they were now, they would not be able to participate in the event. "Well, I understand that you also agree. Then, let's leave the command to Wycross until you return." Skull laughed again this time, and Tigrius cast a spell while feeling a bit anxious. He conveyed the message that he would leave the return of his expeditionary force to Vampire Lord Wycross, who was in charge of the Northern Expedition Force in the center. "All done. Now, then let's go." Skull nodded and put the spur on Bucephalus. Bucephalus ran at full speed, leaving behind green flames, while Salami, which started belatedly, was upset with Skull. Even though Tigrius didn't convey any message, Skull spread the wings of the flames and sped up. Tigrius' hair and beard were quickly messed up because he had no time to cast the windshield magic. But instead of expressing anger, Tigrius laughed like Skull. Grabbing the handle on the back of Salami, he enjoyed the blowing wind. Skullcull, he had to hurry. Today was the day of the wedding of Yongho, their beloved and respected owner. Chapter 288. Epilogue 2. Wow. "My son is a king," Yongho's father shouted in excitement. He was the descendant of Mammon, as well as the father of Yongho, the king of greed. Dressed in a stylish formal dress, he, who was wearing an apron, looked around the wedding hall in excitement. Headed by Dungeon Garrison leader Rickham, the Black Orc squadron dressed in sparkling armor was standing around the hall. Although they were standing there as the guards, Yongho's father thought of the thinly sliced green onions wrapped in fried chicken while looking at them proudly. Each of them was brightening the atmosphere of the wedding hall. Even now, when he closed his eyes, he remembered the day when he met his third daughter-in-law. He was so shocked back then. Turning up the corner of his mouth slightly, Yongho's father showed satisfaction once again. Although he spent the happiest days of his life while staying in the labyrinth of greed during the last few days, he was happiest when he liked to fry chickens, like this, standing in the wedding hall. It wasn't that Yong-ho made his father fry chickens on his wedding day because he was a bad son. Actually, Yong-ho's father volunteered to fry chickens. Yong-ho's father could not believe that chicken was the special menu of those at the labyrinth of greed, praised as the best food in the demon world that demons wanted to eat. He was the happiest today after he opened his chicken shop in the human world 30 years ago. The wedding hall was busy with guests from all over the place. Among them were those who didn't look like demon people at all, such as Winged Harpy, the Big Triant, and the Crawling Slime, etc. "Give me some fried chicken, Wall." While whining, Yong-ho's father lowered his head when the dungeon trio shouted. At the same time, he saw Uriah smiling brightly over the white tablecloth. She looked so lovely when she showed him a couple of crumpled chicken vouchers. "Okay, here you go. I don't need anything like this voucher today." Returning the chicken voucher that got hand-stained, he served them a generous amount of freshly fried chicken. Smiling brightly, Uriah said, "Thank you," while whining. Baduk and the baby dungeon meerkat ran around with joy. Yong-ho's father straightened himself after stroking Uriah's head. Looking at the waiting rooms of the bride and the groom, he laughed heartily again. "Whew, although this is a joint ceremony with Catalina, that's fine with me because I'm his official wife," said Kaiwan, wearing her shoes made of silver dragon leather. She was wearing a silver dragon leather suit, looking like a leotard, as if to show everybody she was Kaiwan. Kaiwan in Scorpio, the Queen of Sword. Because of the suit, she felt like she was wearing a combat suit, not a wedding dress. Catalina, who Kaiwan always called a dumb and innocent lady, pouted her lips when Kaiwan cast a jealous glance. Unlike Kaiwan, Catalina was wearing a white robe, revealing her womanly beauty. It was a beautiful dress made by Yuno in person. Kaiwan, who saw Catalina's tail drooping, smiled and gently hugged her softly. Then she rubbed her cheek against Catalina's face, even at the risk of ruining her makeup. "You don't mind it because I love you so much, Catalina, right?" After all, Catalina burst into laughter, too, flapping her ears and tail. She nodded. Catalina in Libra was in charge of escorting the King of Greed, but she was lovely, as always. Watching the two women, the Queen of Fury, Dhritarashtra, frowned. Although she put on the formal dress befitting the head of her 8 clans, she was not wearing a wedding dress like them. "I feel like I'm very much inferior to them." Dhritarashtra in Virgo is in love with Yong-ho. She was supposed to hold a wedding ceremony with him 2 months later. Unlike Kaiwan and Catalina's joint wedding ceremony, she was having a separate wedding ceremony with him. Definitely, it would be a wedding involving the marriage of the Queen of Fury as the head of her 8 clans and Yong-ho as the master of the House of Mammon. Naturally, their wedding would be different from the current wedding in terms of scale. Tens of thousands of guests would watch their wedding ceremony in the most spectacular event of the demon world. Nonetheless, the Queen of Fury felt she was losing. She didn't expect at all that the two asked to have the wedding ceremony ahead of her. Why does she think she is losing when she is going to have such a great wedding ceremony soon? "Don't you think so?" Kaiwan said with a sarcastic laugh. Moreover, even Catalina, who the Queen of Fury trusted, chimed in, flapping her ears and tail. "It seems like our master has been outdone," Gardamundi whispered to Kurtimuka Gardamundi. Gardamundi turned away from Kurtimuka, as always, while the King of Fury trembled, watching Kaiwan sticking her tongue out. She clenched her teeth, then turned to Kurtimuka. "Dang it, I can't stand it, Kurtimuka. It sounds crazy, but can you ask them to send me a wedding dress?" "Please be patient," Kurtimuka said, embarrassed. Then Gardamundi snapped sharply. "Just break in his room on the wedding night." Kurtimuka got enraged again, but Gardamundi turned away her eyes again, while Kaiwan and the Queen of Fury exchanged fierce glances. Catalina looked toward the wall, flapping her tail, where there was the groom's waiting room. "The bride's waiting room is noisy," said Yong-ho, dressed in dark red robes, with a rather tense expression. Unlike his confident attitude he showed after dismantling the celestial door, he looked a bit diffident now, waiting for the opening of the wedding ceremony. Instead of answering, Sitri took a step closer to him and said, adjusting his clothes, "My beloved master is so blessed. I can't deny it." Yong-ho and Sitri looked at each other and smiled. She opened her lips again, unable to speak out her mind before she knew it. My beloved customer, would you please stay still for a moment? He nodded. She quietly hugged him and buried her head on his chest for a moment. Mammon. She didn't say it loudly. She just felt Mammon, who became greed itself. At the last moment, when he defeated numerous godly men and generals and stood before the celestial door, Yong-ho heard Mammon's voice. Together with Mammon, he destroyed the celestial door with the power of the great demon god. He cut off the connection between the celestial world and the demon world completely, and that was it. Citri never heard Mammon's voice again. What she heard last from him was that he would not allow her to commit suicide. Yong-ho also couldn't feel the presence of Mammon's will anymore. He just felt that Mammon was with him, or Mammon was already united with himself. Hesitating for a moment, Yong-ho hugged her. The two shared their warmth for a long time. Thank you, Citri said, raising her head. He replied, slightly blushing in embarrassment. You're welcome. You can ask me a favor anytime. Oh my God, you won't take back what you have just said, right? Citri suddenly spoke provocatively, and he blinked. Citri master, you've got only 10 minutes before the wedding ceremony. At that moment, he heard assistant butler June serving him a gentle reminder, as if she was checking the wedding time. As the Goblin Ranger's only female member, she, like the butler Eligos, was essential in the labyrinth of greed. Thanks for the reminder, Yong-ho replied, and Citri suddenly withdrew her hands. She made a mischievous smile at him. Yong-ho's wedding began. Yong-ho stood on the podium, while Catalina and Kaiwan stood on both sides. Catalina flapped her tail without hiding her excited feelings, while Kaiwan was shy, unlike her confident attitude in the bride's waiting room. Brother Eli, when will we get married? Asked Ophelia, who was watching them with a warm smile. While he was moved to tears for a moment, Eligos responded, blinking his eyes. Are you pretending not to know what I'm saying? Ophelia grinned at him, nudging him in the ribs gently. He cleared his throat, flinching at her unexpected question for a moment. Looking back at Yong-ho, Eligos shed tears of joy again. I'm glad Kaiwan wasn't dumped by him, said Chwiryong, feeling great relief in the presence of the former masters of the House of Mammon. All of them smiled at Kaiwan when she was shy, not knowing what to do at the moment. It looks like they feel like this when they marry off their children, said Chwiryong, shaking his head a bit, standing in the middle of the spirits of the arena. Opening her eyes wide, Skathak said, Oh my goodness. Is our master your child? Skathak asked gently. Yuno and Eustia looked up at Yong-ho on the podium, just like Chwiryong did. At that moment, there was a small voice heard from the flames of the red lotus next to them. I also agree with Chwiryong just for today, said Amon, the magic spear of the red lotus, who had always been with Yong-ho until now. Isn't our master being anguished highly now? Amon just laughed at Gusion's question. Oh, he has just started it, Yuno said. As she said, Yong-ho on the podium kissed Catalina, and Kaiwan Bergram put the rings on the two women, which he made elaborately. Those participants watching them broke out into exclamation with joy. Baduk was absorbed into enjoying fried chicken, and the baby dungeon meerkat, enjoying chicken, raised her head upright and watched the wedding of the greatest king of the demon world. Flapping her wings, Lucia looked to the side. Instead of putting the crispy fried chicken in her mouth, she lightly touched Uriah's shoulder, who was looking at Yong-ho, Catalina, and Kaiwan, blushing. They didn't need to talk to each other about it. Lucia looked askance at her while Uriah nodded enthusiastically. Demon god of greed, Yong-ho Cheon, master of the great Mammon family. The one who had saved the demon world, just like Mammon in the past. Yong-ho hugged Catalina suddenly. He then kissed Kaiwan and held Jatara Shutra in his arms, who came running to him when she couldn't stand it. He was the most greedy man in the demon world, after all. He didn't give up anything he laid his hand on. Citri looked at him and smiled brightly, shaking off her 1,000 years of agony.